I don't believe in kid food. Kids are human beings. Yes, we need to feed them appropriately, weaning and that kind of stuff. But before all these processed foods and packaging and special shapes were invented, they were just eating a mashed up or smaller pieces of what the family ate. So this whole idea that there is kid food or a special diet that appeals to them is really made up and pushed forth as a commercial agenda. And it has nothing to do with child nutrition or what children really can eat.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber, and today I'm talking with Jennifer Scribner, a nutritional therapy practitioner and author of the new book, From Mac and Cheese to Veggies, Please: How to Get Your Kids to Eat New Foods, End Picky Eating Forever, and Stay Sane in the Process, which is based on her work with hundreds of clients and details how any parent can dramatically change the diet of their pickiest kids. I know that many of us raising differently wired kids have challenges surrounding food, whether it's sensitivities to textures, intolerances, or simply our desire to get them to expand their food choices to include more greens and healthier options. In this conversation, Jennifer and I talked about how to achieve these goals, all while eliminating battles around the dinner table. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, Jennifer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to talking about this. We have not done too many episodes on nutrition. And when I heard about your book about picky eaters, I think even just that phrase, picky eaters, is something that me and many of our listeners are like, oh my gosh, I need to know more about this, because it, especially with differently wired kids, the issue of picky eaters is, it's something a lot of us are dealing with. So I think you're going to have a lot of insight to share for us today.
Yeah, it's a really common struggle.
Yes, absolutely. So before we get into talking about your book, can you just first introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are? And I always like to ask people's personal why. So why you do the work that you do.
Sure. Yeah. So I am by education a nutritional therapy practitioner, and I got into this field for my own reasons of wanting to have clear skin. But what brought me into kind of the current why was working with nutrition, and I'm also a GAPS diet practitioner, gut and psychology syndrome. I primarily ended up working with kids on the autism spectrum with sensory processing disorder or with serious gut issues, eczema, life-threatening allergies. And one of the places I was finding a lot of success was helping people with picky eating one-on-one. But then in the wider world, I saw so many families not making any food changes because they were so afraid that their kids wouldn't eat and they couldn't overcome any of this picky eating. So they're just kind of sitting on the fence there, feeling like they want to make changes, but not doing it. And that is what prompted me to write the book. And that's a message I just don't think is being talked about enough, that how doable this is. So I feel really passionate about whatever food changes you want to make. We all want our kids to be healthier and to have more nutrients in their diet. Here's the steps you can take to do that, whatever plan you're choosing.
That's fantastic. You know, just hearing you talk about that. I talked about this when I had a nutritionist on probably a year and a half ago on the podcast to talk about specifically the relationship between diet and ADHD. And one of the things that I said to her was, I always felt as if, I have so many other things that I'm focusing on. I don't have the energy to focus on this. Like, I'm already dealing with this in school problem, just all of these other issues. I'm like, if I dive into dietary changes, I may lose my mind. So I think that sitting on the fence and it just feeling just too daunting and overwhelming you probably hear that all the time. And I think it's really great that you're breaking it down for people.
And that's the thing that that's how it feels from the beginning. But once you make these changes and the food time isn't a battle, or you can make one meal that your whole family eats instead of pulling out, special things or special preparation for your picky kid, you actually have more time on your hands and you have more energy. And if these changes help your kid sleep better, focus better, lessen, tantrums, that kind of thing, that adds a lot back into your life as far as time and energy. So for me, diet is foundational. Of course, I'm biased. I'm a nutritional therapist, but that's how I've seen the changes play out within my clients and the people I've worked with.
Yeah, well, those all sound like very good outcomes, things we would all want. So, before we get into some of the practical tips in your book, how would you even define, what would be considered typical picky eating versus picky eating that is problematic?
Yeah, so there is a phase where picky eating is common and typical, and that's usually around 2 to 3 years old. It can be considered part of the terrible twos that we talk about. And that is where kids may like one thing one day, hate it the next day, really hyper focus on one food, refuse to try other things. And it is a phase if we're allowing our kids to eat whole foods and we keep offering the variety of real things. Where that tends to get off track is when our kids eat refined foods or more sugary things, and that becomes their preference, and they become addicted to this sugar cycle. And that's where it tends to, go on longer, and it's considered chronic if it lasts more than a couple of years. So when this is going on at 4 years, at 10 years, at 12 years, that's about 40% of kids that go through that picky eating phase, but then turn into chronic picky eaters. And I myself, even with a neurotypical brain, was a fairly picky eater until I was in my 30s. Wow. It took me a long time because I grew up on processed food. So my go-tos were the macaroni and cheese and the top ramen and the popcorn and the chips. And they're things I still enjoy sometimes. But now I also eat a wide variety of vegetables and, other whole foods, and those things are sprinkled in. So when it drags on a long time and when it is really hyper focused, which is so common with autism, the 5 foods, that's where it's really problematic.
So 40% of kids end up being chronic picky eaters. That's astounding to me.
In one longitudinal study that was done in the Journal of Eating Behavior, that's what they found they looked at kids from like 2 to 12 years old. That was something that really shocked me. But when you think about it, we kind of play it off as adults. I mean, I know a lot of 30-year-olds that just still want to drive through McDonald's every day, and we think it's a convenience, but some of it is that we haven't expanded our palate and we are really married to certain foods rather than having a wide variety.
Well, I also think for a lot of us, we do what I call accidental parenting, and by the time you've been doing something and then all of a sudden it's now your new reality. And we're like, wait a minute, I did not mean for that habit to form. How did that happen? And that probably is very common. You see that a lot with parents, I imagine.
Yeah. And that was something that I learned when I was younger. I was a school bus driver. And so having 60 kids that I was responsible for in one place, driving on the road, like that really taught me a lot about the behaviors that you could put up with and, turn the blind eye to when you have 1 or 2 kids versus having a classroom full or a school bus full was different. Like you see the compounded results much more clearly. So I felt like that was a really good experience for me to see why some of this structure is so important.
So I'm curious, so you are in Portland, Oregon, and as I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking about Pamela Druckerman's book, Bringing Up Baby, and how the French are raising kids. And, there's a big focus in that book that the French kids eat anything because they're offered cassoulet or they're offered, what the adults are eating. I'm just curious your perspective on this. We have listeners from all over the world. Would you say this is more of an American issue? Is it a global issue? What do you say about that?
I would say it tends to be more of a Western country issue. I definitely have, clients like this in the UK and, other areas in Europe. And it's something that's growing more in developing countries and in Asian countries because they're a little later to the game on having a lot of processed food, so they have a better opportunity to keep their food traditions and to keep food more natural. And one thing that's really important that's changed is that we have marketing around food in the United States that tells us what kid food is, that there is a special food that kids like to eat. And I don't believe in kid food. Kids are human beings. Yes, we need to feed them appropriately, weaning and that kind of stuff. But before all these processed foods and packaging and special shapes were invented, they were just eating a mashed up or smaller pieces of what the family ate. So this whole idea that there is kid food or a special diet that appeals to them is really made up and pushed forth as a commercial agenda, and it has nothing to do with child nutrition or what children really can eat.
Yeah, so interesting. It's not a big thing over here. I've lived in Amsterdam for 5 years now, and there aren't as many options in general in the supermarket of things to eat, and there really isn't a lot of marketing to kids. I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned that, and I remembered all the shapes of different foods and chicken nuggets and all the things that were available when Asher was younger. It's interesting.
Yeah, and the placement that we have in the stores for those things to be so easy to, grab for kids here in the US. Yeah, so there's a lot of psychology that goes behind selling you the idea of kid foods and their processed foods.
Interesting. So can you say a little bit more about, this physiology behind pickiness? So you mentioned this introduction to these more refined foods. Like, is that really what is happening? Are we dulling our kids' senses, or, what's going on behind the scenes that's creating this culture of pickiness?
Yeah, there can be a number of different factors that come into play. And especially within the autism spectrum, there's a combination. It's rarely just one thing. So the first thing can be distorted sensory processing. So if we have those sensory issues and we have a brain that's not processing appropriately how things taste, their stuff doesn't taste the same to us as it does to our kids. So there can be those type of reasons where we're like, this is a good thing. Why don't you like this? And they're not sensing it the same way that we are, whether that be the flavor, the texture, the consistency, temperature, those things. And then a big part is the cravings for the sweet and starchy foods. And that can come from abnormal gut flora, overgrowth of things like candida in the gut that crave the sugars, whether we like it or not. Even within myself, there was a period of time where I would be eating, sugary things. I'm like, I'm not enjoying this. This isn't pleasurable. Why am I doing this? And it was almost like outside of myself, like uncontrollable kind of compulsion for sweets, that I was in this addiction to them. And that happens to our kids too. Another reason can be sometimes the state of the mouth. So if we have issues with our saliva glands, if they have tongue tie, lip tie, those physical kind of structural issues that can come into play, then that can make it harder to chew. And often we'll see this first crop up with kids that have a hard time latching and nursing. And then sometimes there are issues with secretions, and this isn't something people think a lot, but every time we secrete something, that can be a way to detox something or to flush something out of the body. And if we have a saliva that's coming into contact with things like vegetables, which have detoxifying antioxidants, that's why we praise them so much, that can actually feel uncomfortable in the mouth. That can cause, itching or stinging or burning. And our kids don't communicate these things the way that we do. They communicate through behavior. And that's why it can be so difficult to realize if these, smaller issues are really what's driving some of this, because they can say, oh, I refuse this food, or they'll, throw a tantrum about something versus saying, oh, this stings in my mouth. Right. They don't have that option.
We'll be right back after this quick break. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls. And with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free, there are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. So that's so interesting. So this isn't just a matter of a child being inflexible or, I being familiar with sensory processing issues and knowing that texture and sensations can be really intense and different for kids with sensory integration issues. So that makes sense to me, but I hadn't thought about everything you said is just fascinating to me, that it can be this very strong physical response that you're having. So it's not just a decision. They're not just deciding, I'm going to not try anything else.
Right. And that's how so much of picky eating is seen, that this is a kid's being bad, being, defiant. And it's really so much beyond that physiologically. So that's something else that I want to dispel, that it isn't just a power struggle that you're having with your kids, and that the behaviors are telling you something that may not be the way you would perceive it with a neurotypical kid. But even with neurotypical kids, these things can be going on as well.
Well, yeah, we always talk about the fact that all behavior is communication, and that there is always a reason. There's always a reason why your child is upset or reacting in a certain way. And this is just another example of that. So that makes perfect sense.
Yes.
So I'm just curious, with that sensory defensiveness to food textures, or, having those really strong reaction to certain feelings and temperatures and tastes and smells, is that something that kids can overcome? And what does that actually look like?
Yeah, in my experience, it's a combination of getting them nourished and detoxified, and then also working through sensory therapies or food therapies with kids to help them break through some of that. But part of this can happen in the brain if we have toxicity within the brain that is preventing the signals from being processed properly. That a lot of people, when they think about the toxicity, they think there's something that needs to be detoxed or pulled, but our detoxification system is run through nutrients. So for me, adding in the nutrients is really the most crucial thing, so that our bodies can start managing any toxicity on their own and working through any type of backlog that we have inherited or accumulated from our environment. And some kids are more sensitive and susceptible to absorbing these things than others, based on, like the MTHFR variations that we hear about in the community. So there's a certain amount of kind of nourishment that needs to happen. To me, that's really foundational. But then you can also work through some of the sensory steps, putting it on the plate, not eating it, touching it to the lips, tasting it, spitting it out, and as is appropriate for, your kid and what their sensory issues are. And I'm definitely not opposed to adding things into the texture that they like at first. So if your kid only wants things as a smoothie, cool. We can throw probiotics in there. We can throw veggies in there. We can sneak a lot of things in. Same things for kids who really go for, ground meat. Yeah, we can stuff all kinds of things in there that gets it into the body, that gets this process kind of kickstarted.
Yeah, I always felt sorry for myself because Asher would not eat drink a smoothie. They were just not happening. And I was like, but there's so much I could do with this smoothie, But that is good advice that there are ways to get things in there.
Yeah. And at the same time, introducing the foods to kids in other ways so that they are having those exposures. Because even within normal picky eating, it takes 8 to 12 exposures to decide if we like something. So if we have these sensory issues going on top of that, it can take many more tries, many more experiences with a food before we're comfortable with it, before we can maybe try it or take that chance with it.
So I'm curious to know what this actually looks like then. So say someone is listening to this episode who is like, okay, I've been wanting to do this. I feel like I want to make some changes. And maybe they have a suggestion from a pediatrician or something that they know they want to try. How can they set themselves up for success? How do they even begin? Do they sit the child down and talk with them about it? Maybe that depends on the age, but where do they begin if they want to make some big changes in their child's nutritional habits?
I think beginning with mindset is really the crucial piece, and to make sure that everyone in the family or that's, within the household is on board. Because when you decide the changes you want to make, you want to be sure that everyone is willing and able to go along with that. Because if you have a mixed message within the home or even within, school, that this person's going to take pity on me and feed me, my sugar addiction type foods, they'll hold out for that. And that can mean more of that power struggle rather than just the simple physiology. So to me, getting your mindset right, getting everyone on board, and then laying out your plan, deciding this is what we're going to start, this is how we're going to start, so that you can start once and go with it rather than dive in for a couple days and then give up because, we have a tantrum or something like that. And there's a few different methods that I have used with clients and I talk about within my book. And the first is applied behavioral analysis. And if somebody's already using an ABA program and that's working with their kids successfully, that can be applied to food and that can be a way to bring new things in. The second option I use is backing into it and just saying, here's an important food that we really want to bring in, and let's find a way to get that in, whether it be offering it, sneaking it. Let's work on, one step at a time. And then the other option is to just go cold turkey and say, we're going to follow this particular dietary protocol. This day it starts. All we're offering is this, and we're willing to go through the fights until you eat. And that one takes a lot of courage, a lot of support, and I've done that with parents most often because that's where they would need my one-on-one support, because that can be tough. And it's a really, really intense week. But when it's a few months down the road and people will write me and say, my kid's just eating broccoli and they're going to sleep easily at night. And I can't believe I never thought they would eat these things. And now they're doing so happily, or they're asking for more. So it's kind of that ripping the Band-Aid off. But it's really intense at first. And most people will do a combination. You might, back into a couple things, and you might do some ABA type agreements with your kid. And then you might choose a day, when you've worked some things in where you're like, all right, now we're going cold turkey. We're not having the goldfish crackers anymore after this day. Because sometimes you notice, oh, well, then when my kid has that, that's really when we have a tantrum. That's really the day I cannot get them to settle down and sleep. So then it can become less and less worth it to keep that food in even some of the time. And so you want to find an alternative. And to your question about talking with the kids, that really does depend on the age, the developmental level. Working with older kids, you got to have their buy-in, especially if they're going to be doing things outside of your supervision.
Right.
And to me, with middle school, teenage kind of kids, we have to figure out their motivation. And a lot of times, some of our kids can be motivated by they get into the science of the food and what are the food additives and what are the things that don't work for my body. And you can go down that little science experiment road. But with other kids, they're more motivated by acne, motivated by mood swings, social anxieties. And so when you can help them internalize how food is affecting those things for them, then that can be a real motivator in the long run.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I'm just curious, do parents need to do the same thing? Like, is this I know the whole family has to be on board, but does that mean if we're cutting out all gluten, then the whole family's cutting out all gluten?
I think it's best to cut it out at home, at least. If you're having lunch at work and you have something else and that works for you, then that's fine. But I think it's best to keep things really on the same page at home. So there isn't that competition or feeling left out, or why do I have to have this special food when everyone else gets to have, dessert and I don't get to? That can create a lot of unhappiness and kind of sibling rivalry. So I think having everyone on board at home is important. And for many of us, we see our own food addictions and compulsions and our own up and down energy and our own reliance on processed food. So if it's something that you recognize in yourself that you would benefit from, then it's a great opportunity to change your own diet and your own health as well. And since I've worked with the GAPS diet, which is all homemade, all whole foods, I will usually have people typically mom, start the diet in advance of putting the kids on it so that she can go through her own grumpy period of like, now I don't get to eat cake anymore. And, I'm so angry that all I want is nothing that's in this house, that kind of thing. We all go through that little phase and kind of come back out of that and feel better and have more clear energy, more clear mind before putting the kids on a new plan. Because when you're all in that grumpy state together, it can feel really ugly.
I bet.
So going through that yourself, getting your own, good attitude back can be useful before putting your kids through that. And then you'll also be able to be more resilient because you know the benefits that wait on the other side.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything. Because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Hey, are you a parent of a teenager? Are you feeling overwhelmed about how to be what they need while also holding limits and boundaries that keep them safe? Are you tired of conversations that negate how messy this season of parenting is? Well, I've got you. My name is Casey O'Rourke. I am a positive discipline trainer, parent coach, and the host of the Joyful Courage podcast. Every week, I come to you with an interview digging into tough topics with experts I trust and solo shows that go deep into the personal growth and mindset needed to raise teens in a way that grows them into confident, capable, young people. I am not afraid of getting real about the intersection of conscious parenting and the teen years, while also bringing in vulnerability, humor, and lightness. I'm walking the path with you and honored to serve. Listen to Joyful Courage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you consume podcasts.
That's such a smart idea, starting at first. And
I know.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And moms are really, great at putting their kids first.
Yeah.
And not doing these kinds of things for ourselves. So I think I encourage mom and women to, put themselves first a little bit on this and to gain your experience. And especially if you're doing something that is requiring more cooking skills or a different way of eating than you're used to, you're going to be a lot more forgiving as you're picking up those skills than your kids would be. So just doing it for yourself a little bit can help you gain confidence in that part as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So towards the end of your book, one of your chapters is My Child Won't ... And I love that chapter because you basically take my child won't drink water, my child won't eat veggies, all these things that I'm sure every parent is, at least some of them are going to apply to them. Like, what do I do about this? Can you tell us a little bit about that chapter and how you figured all of that out?
Yeah, it was really with my client work and just brainstorming with people and seeing what worked for them. Because with the GAPS diet, we include, bone broth. And if kids won't drink bone broth, how can we get that into their diet every day? So we got to cook all our meats in it. We got to put it in a smoothie. We can, reheat our veggies in it. Like whatever your kid latches onto, we're going to run with that and find a way to get these other foods in. And so it was just kind of the mishmash of everything that I've seen come up and the common foods amongst healing diets, because that's been my focus. And, several different suggestions of how we can bring those things in just to troubleshoot and make it a little bit easier and get you guys thinking about, what is another option? There has to be a way that we can do this. And that's part of that mindset thing too, versus so many of us are like, my kid will never. But if we open our mind to how could I get this in? How could I sneak this into their food? Mm-hmm. That's a different question for our brain to work on. And that can get the juices kind of flowing in our mind about a new idea as well.
Yeah. Well, I just appreciated how practical it was. This is definitely a book that if people are looking to make changes, you're telling them exactly how to do it and how to just tackle these challenges that may seem overwhelming and undoable. So when I got to that chapter, I was like, oh, this is just so great to have it all spelled out for people.
Thanks. Yeah, I am a practical person by nature.
Yeah.
And very much a step-by-step person.
Yeah, it's awesome. So if parents are listening to this and they're feeling super determined and inspired, what, do you have maybe one or two pieces of advice? You talked about the importance of mindset, but what could they do like today, as they're listening to this podcast and they're like, okay, I'm ready to get started. What's the first or second thing that they should do? Where do they start?
I think choosing a food or a food group that you feel like your kid's really missing out on and you really want to bring in, and finding a way to bring that in. Just, choosing one thing and kind of backing into it, trying something new. And it surprised me. I've heard from so many parents who've read the book and say, I just tried a couple of things tonight and the kids were actually open to it. So especially when you've kind of given up and it's been maybe many months or years since you've tried something new, they can surprise you that they may be open to the novelty of something all of a sudden. So that's why I always say people, can start. If you want your kids to eat veggies, can you sneak something in a smoothie? Can you grind it up and put it in a hamburger patty? What's a creative way you could use that just to try it tonight?
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, one of the things that we found worked in terms of just introducing more foods and thinking about food differently was just watching some documentaries together. Like that sugar film was one that we really liked. I don't know if you've seen that. It was an Australian filmmaker and it was a little bit like Super Size Me, but he went on a diet where for 30 or 60 days, he was eating kind of hidden sugars, the amount that the average Australian was consuming daily.
And I have not seen that.
It's so good. And he was someone who did not eat sugar at all prior to that. And so just watching how his body changed made a big impression on Asher. And it's been really interesting to see him take more ownership and make better choices over the food that he's eaten. So for the older kids too, exposing them to some of the science, as you said, and then also some of the great material that's out there that could really make an impression on them.
Yeah, that's a great example. And another thing is getting your kids involved in food in other ways. Will they go to a farm with you and pick something? Can you grow a garden? Can they pick out a veggie at the grocery store and help you learn to prep, or, help you prep it and learn that? Because kids are much more okay with trying something new when they have that personal connection to it in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk in your book about, different ages, how they can be involved. And certainly, if they are kids who enjoy being part of the food prep process or making dinners, that it is an excellent way to motivate them to try new things. So, okay, I would like to know, where can listeners find you? Where can they learn more about your book, From Mac and Cheese to Veggies, please? And yeah, just tell us the best way for listeners to engage with you.
Yeah, so the book is available on Amazon. It's a Kindle, it's a hardback, it's a paperback, whichever way you want it, it's available there. And then my website is bodywisdomnutrition.com. And I have a tab for parents that talks about the book. And I also blog about picky eating, parenting issues, and just an overall non-toxic lifestyle, since that's another piece that I came to in my work with kids on the spectrum was, how do we reduce the toxic burden that's coming into our household? And so I kind of blog about all those issues, about this lifestyle there.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, I will include links to all of Jennifer's resources, her blog, her book, and I will put those on the show notes page. So definitely check out Jennifer's book and the work that she's doing on her website. Jennifer, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm so curious to hear feedback from people because, again, I think this is something so many parents in our community are dealing with. So thanks for the practical insights and for the work that you put out there.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. For the show notes for this episode, including links to Jennifer's book, From Mac and Cheese to Veggies, Please, and all the other resources we discussed, visit tiltparenting.com/session114. If you'd like what we're doing at the Tilt Parenting Podcast and you'd like to support us, there are a few easy and meaningful ways you can do this. One is to join my Patreon campaign, just like listeners Bree Overly and Alexandra LaRose did. Thank you, Bree and Alexandra. Patreon is an online platform that allows people to make a small monthly contribution to support the work of an artist or a musician, or in my case, a podcaster. It's super easy to sign up, and even a small donation helps. If you'd like to support the show, visit patreon.com/tiltparenting. That's patreon.com/tiltparenting, or you can find a link on the Tilt Parenting website on the podcast page. The other way you can help is to head over to iTunes and leave a rating or a review, or both if you haven't done so already. There are a lot of parenting podcasts out there, and ratings and reviews help keep the podcast highly visible, which in turn makes it a lot easier for me to send out those emails and get the big guests to agree to come on the show. So thank you so much. And thanks again for listening. For more information on Tilt Parenting, visit www.tiltparenting.com.
If you're a parent, I invite you to join us at the Mindful Mama podcast, where it's all about becoming a less irritable, more joyful parent. With sometimes hilarious and always thought-provoking experts and friends, at Mindful Mama, we know that you cannot give what you do not have. And when you have calm and peace within, then you can give it to your children. I'm Hunter Clark Fields, and I can't wait to see you there. Listen in to the Mindful Mama podcast.